Thank you very much, Keith. I'm not Joe Kaplan, as has been indicated, and I'm not Abe Kaplan. I'm sure that you join with me in my great and deep regret that Abe has left us and has gone to not greener pastures at all, just different pastures at the University of Michigan. We're hopeful, however, that we'll bring him back from time to time and perhaps present him to you again. Perhaps Abe, more than anyone, and his activity at the university, and particularly as far as we're concerned, of course, for university extension, reflected some of the things that have been happening in this community and to some degree, I'm sure, throughout the rest of the country. I don't know whether you remember some years ago, it must have been 4 or 5 years ago perhaps, that something rather phenomenal happened. As you know, those of you who come to the campus frequently, it's terribly busy almost every night of the week. We wanted to schedule a course in contemporary philosophy. Not a popular course, but a rather thoughtful one dealing with basic current concepts in philosophy with existentialism and comparison of Hegelian and Romantic philosophy and some insights into Buddhist philosophy. And we couldn't find a hall seating a couple of hundred, which we thought Abe might attract because he's very popular. We finally had to select a hall on a Sunday night. And just about the day after the notices went out, this hall of 200 or 300 was all sold out. And these were not free lectures. We decided to move it to a larger hall, seating about 500, and within a day or so, that was sold out. We shifted it from Moore Hall to Royce Hall Auditorium that seats about 2,000, and within several days, that too was sold out. And we ended by sending back, and this was, of course, perhaps the greatest heartbreak, we sent back about 1,000 checks. Of course, Lord knows how many others would have come in had people not heard that this course was sold out. Now, the interesting thing about that is not a tribute to our merchandising, I hope, but to the enormous groundswell of interest in ideas that is true not only of this community, but many communities throughout the country. And this is something that perhaps we here can document to a greater degree than almost anyone else because of our vast extension operation. And this is very exciting indeed, and we'll refer to it a little later on. Now, you have been discussing leisure and problems of urban life for the past 4 or 5 lectures, and I'm sure that you've had some definitions of leisure as to what it is and what it is not. Those of you who love the French poets, I'm sure, will remember, as I know Professor Speroni in front of me does, that Baudelaire asserted unequivocally that the natural occupation of the leisured was love. Without leisure, he would say, love could only be a plebeian orgy or the fulfillment of a conjugal duty. Instead of a fiery caprice, it becomes an act of utility and nothing else. Now, leisure meant that for Baudelaire, and in the periods of a class society, as Professor Berwick has indicated, the arts, the cultural arts, were the preoccupation and the privilege of a leisured class only, the mass of the people, afflicted with long hours of work, had no time or interest or preparation for any enjoyment or participation in the arts. Now, the Industrial Revolution, interestingly, and the Reformation did a number of things. It not only brought large masses of people to the cities and provided a density of population which previously had not existed, it also, in religious and civic terms, attempted to glorify the notion of work. And I suspect that we had been sold a bill of goods that somehow work in of itself is a wonderful thing, a God-given thing, and God-fearing men would love work and extend their efforts at work. Now, I myself see nothing glorious about work that has no other aspects to it but sheer drudgery and labor. And for many people, through the early days of the period of industrialization, and to some degree even today, that is all that work is. And we began to look upon leisure or free time as non-work, as absence from work. But leisure is more than free time, as those of us who happen to have a free day at home find out very soon. There are all kinds of chores that have to be done. A woman who doesn't work and who stays at home is not a leisure person. She's afflicted with all kinds of pressures, all kinds of duties, all kinds of preoccupations which are time-consuming, many of which are tedious, and which are not especially productive or satisfying in terms of any fulfillment of individual needs and creative desires that people may have. Now, today, we have far more leisure than people have ever had in the history of mankind. Although, again, strangely enough, despite the vast increases in the rate of productivity, both in the United States and throughout the Western world, the amount of leisure time has not at all increased at the rate that our productive capacities makes possible. Interestingly enough, John Stuart Mill pointed this out 100 years ago, even at that time. The increase in productivity, which might have made for far more leisure time in terms of our productive capacities, did not quite provide a concurrent and comparable increase in leisure time. And that is just as true today. Our productive capacities, our ability to produce the needs of all of our people, and indeed for many people abroad, is much greater than we actually utilize, as we well know. Some 7 or 8 years ago, at a time, you recall that in the early 50s, there was a vast increase in expansion in the building of capital plant in the United States. And yet, even at that time, of the new plant that was built, only 5 to 10% of new plant, not modifications of old plant, but only from 5 to 10% of the new plant that was built in those years was built to the maximum degree of automative possibility that we were capable of at that time. And for the most part, even new plant, for various reasons, brand new plants are not built with the ability to produce at the potential of automated processes that we're capable of and that we know of. So that actually we have today the potentiality of far greater productivity in terms of our knowledge of process, and the availability of resources and materials than we actually engage upon. Theoretically, we could probably have a 2 or 3 hour day and, utilizing all our plant capacity and all our skills, produce as much and more than we produce today. And of course, we have, on the other hand, the dreadful anomaly, which we tend to accept as inevitable, why I don't know, of storing enormous quantities of food, while in other parts of the world people need food badly. And yet we take this as one of the facts of contemporary life, that somehow you've just got to accumulate foods. You don't throw it on the market. It'll depress prices here. It'll depress prices abroad. And so we engage and accept a sort of built-in illogic of which we ourselves become the victim in terms of our international relationships. We develop a kind of a theoretic morality, which you will recall as Zangwill mentioned in terms of what the Bible meant to the British. We do the same in terms of our general morality. You may recall that talking about the British, who are great Bible readers, he remarked that the Bible was the ledger of the Britisher on Sundays, but the ledger was his Bible on weekdays. And in a sense, this is our general practice. We categorize and pigeonhole many of our moral attitudes, our whole moral Christian Judaic ethique, which we preserve for Sundays, for teaching of children, particularly when they're young, but not when they get too old, because then it becomes a matter of, well, business is business, and religion and ethic is something that becomes a personal matter. And yet these are the kinds of contradictions in our society which we tend to accept and which penetrate all aspects of our lives. Now, ours has been called a consumer society, and all of our efforts have devolved not on production, as had once been the case, where the pressures of sheer survival were terribly great. One produced in order to survive, in order to live. Today, our productive capacities are so enormous that our problem is no longer producing, but how do you get people to consume more than they are presently consuming, which is a curious aspect of our civilization, where again, on the one hand, ours being a have nation, we have a tremendous problem of consumption, yet the greater part of the world is suffering from a great need for greater productivity and greater availability of goods. And because of this emphasis on consumption, the pushing of goods and materials at ever greater rates, of attempting to persuade people to buy more and a greater variety of things than they actually need, we have become a completely acquisitive and thing or material-oriented society. And what I sense is happening today, and I hope you will disagree with me if you think I'm wrong, and you will have an opportunity to do so before we're through this evening. I think one of the great difficulties has been that, having been satiated with the pressure of things, we have gradually, with our increased leisure time, and with our greater perception and education, and I suspect intelligence and cultivation, we're beginning to realize that the mere accumulation of things is not the answer to man's happiness and to man's satisfaction in life. When we are young, the mere need to get ahead, to develop a career, to concentrate on success in the American sense, tends to absorb all of our efforts and our entire concentration. And suddenly we wake up in our mid-30s or early 40s, and of course some of you perhaps in your 20s because you were more precocious than I hope. We suddenly wake up one day and we begin to wonder what this is all about. Why this constant drive to accumulate more and more things, to make more and more money, to buy the bigger house and the bigger house and the second car or the third car, to have the third television set. And we recognize that the sheer increase in commodities does not give us a commensurate increase in terms of our personal happiness and our ability to get greater basic satisfaction out of life. Now this, I suspect, is one of the reasons why the universities, all of our adult education programs, the cultural arts, partly have increased to the degree that they have. The fact that perhaps people are searching, there's a malaise in terms of the kinds of things that occupy our daily lives and the consequent dissatisfaction that tends to lead us towards other answers, and a conviction that no longer can the mere accumulation of commodities satisfy the deeper urges that most of us tend to experience. And I think this is generally characteristic. And of course, it contributes to widening gaps in many of our relationships. I'm not going to spend much time on the statistics of divorce or delinquency as an aspect of greater leisure time and of our technology and of our material satiation, but there's no question that in an affluent society, in a leisure time society, you get increasingly a gap between the acquisition of the goods, the preoccupation with the job, and on the other hand, the leisure to do things that ought to give us satisfaction and which somehow don't, because they are time spent away from the job, which we have been taught and conditioned to feel are the most important things that we can do. And this is something that starts at a very early age. Painful efforts are being made today in industry to teach people just short of their retirement how to spend their leisure time. And this is a pathetic effort, it seems to me, because here we're taking people who all their lives have been geared to a particular way of life, to particular values, and suddenly you say to them, well, now you're going to be retired for 10 or 15 years, we're going to teach you some hobbies, and these are going to occupy you. Now, these are obviously makeshift. People don't suddenly develop hobbies that make any sense, that have any real meaning. They're obviously a means of whiling away the time, and you're sort of waiting until you die, and so you play shuffleboard or you play checkers in the park, and you meet with other older people who are in the same boat, and you sit and you patiently wait for death to overtake you. Now, the matter of usefully spending one's leisure time is not something that one can learn suddenly just on the verge or threshold of retirement. The way one spends one's leisure time when one is old is the way one has spent it when one was young. And the kinds of satisfaction one gets when one is old is the kinds of perceptions and experiences and the kinds of enjoyments and appreciations one has learned and practiced all their lives. Now, you and I'm sure, I certainly have had grandparents, and perhaps some of us have had parents who've worked hard all their lives, who've come from the old school, an old school in which the primary object of life was to earn a living and to bring up a family. And suddenly the family has left. All the children are grown up, and the old folks are left alone. They've never developed habits of deep or wide reading. They've never cultivated the arts. They've never cultivated leisure time experiences. And suddenly there's no purpose left in their lives. And children are terribly concerned. They try to interest their parents in an organization. They'll try to interest them in going to a senior citizens club. And these are rather pathetic, vicarious experiences. They're not intrinsically real experiences that these folks can enjoy and find any fulfillment in. They're substitutes. And unless throughout the period of our lives, and this starts at a very early age, it seems to me, unless we develop this breadth of interest, because this is the essence of living and not work. And I think this perhaps is the cancer and what's wrong in our society. The fact that at a very early period, the basic emphasis is on making a living and getting ahead professionally or career-wise, and work becomes the object of life rather than life itself. What I'm trying to say is that, by and large, we have been brought up, and many of us tend to live in order to work. And basically, the object of work is not work itself. The object of work is to be able to live, and only that. Now, those of us who are fortunate enough to be engaged in the kind of work that has satisfaction in and of itself, and many professionals do, and I think university people in that regard are especially fortunate that many of the kinds of things they do, they can get great personal, deep satisfaction out of. But a vast majority of the population engaged in work does not get that kind of satisfaction out of their work. And so we preach a kind of make-believe. We tend to tell workers who are operating a drill press all day or operating on an assembly line that somehow there's something wonderful and holy about what they're doing, that they ought to be loyal about their jobs, they ought to be excited about it. And we teach them teamwork and loyalty to the company and all the other things that management people have to do or feel they have to do in order to turn out a product and turn out a good rate of profit. Now, actually, this is rather silly, and basically it's dishonest. There's no reason why people should get excited about engaging in drudgery. And I've met with many industrial relations people on how do you get motivation among workers, how do you develop a sense of teamwork and belonging to the team and loyalty to the company. And it seems to me that the most honest approach to that sort of situation is to say very plainly to workers who do not have very great skills, who are engaged in simple repetitive jobs, And incidentally, many of these jobs, of course, are being eliminated because it's the repetitive job that's most susceptible to automative processes. But it seems to me that the only honest and decent thing to do and the most helpful thing to do to workers engaged in that kind of work is to say, now see here, this isn't very exciting work. We know it isn't exciting work. Somebody has to do it. We're paying you well to do it. Now let's get along with the job, do the job. I know it isn't very exciting, but let's see whether you can't get your satisfactions outside and off the job. And if people demonstrate considerable abilities or skills or intellectual abilities and are engaged in humdrum jobs, then part of the concern and responsibility of management is to try to help them to train for better jobs which can utilize their skills better than they do at the present time. Now, this may sound somewhat shocking in terms of our traditional practice in industrial relations, but it seems to me that this kind of honest and direct approach can actually be lots more fruitful, because the worker isn't fooled by slogans of teamwork and of blind loyalty that don't make any sense in that kind of situation. And over the long run, when it's put on the basis of, look, you're being paid for a day's work and you do a day's job, and let's find other ways of getting satisfactions, I think it makes for a more honest human relationship in the industrial situation. Now, the nature of life, it seems to me, as it has developed ever since the period of the Greeks until our own day, is the dichotomy in our lives, as I've implied thus far, of what is necessitous and what we do in our really free time. There are levels of existence, as Hannah Arendt has pointed out in an extraordinary book which I hope you'll have a chance to read, The Human Condition. She has pointed out that there are two levels of existence, that of necessity and that of freedom, that of mere survival and that of adventure and choice and courage. Now, the level of necessity are those that most of us are accustomed to in our normal everyday lives. Those are the things that we have no choice but that we've got to do. We've got to get up in the morning if we're women and get the kids off to school. A man's got to get up and he's got to get off to his job. We've got to work in order to live. Now, these are the necessitous areas. It's interesting to note that in a former society, in one of the most glorious periods of artistic development, and that is, of course, the Hellenistic period, this kind of work was not glorified at all. In fact, it wasn't done by the free citizen. It was done by slaves. And no one glorified the drudgery, the labor, and they called it slave labor, and it was done by slaves. And the job of the free man was not to engage in that kind of labor. The job of the free man, of the citizen, was the public works. It was the engaging in the arts, it was engaging in the politics of his day, and of exercising his rights and responsibilities as a citizen. And the laborious job of maintaining subsistence was done by the slave. Now, I'm not suggesting that we develop slaves in our day, and it isn't possible were we even to attempt it. However, it is increasingly possible in another sense, in that today we have managed to develop a technology that can actually take the place of the role that the slaves played in the Hellenistic period. For the first time, without degrading other human beings, without any degradation at all, or taking advantage or exploiting other human beings, it is possible to have our slave work done by the machine so that people can begin to turn their attention and their efforts towards the job of being human beings and living only as humans can live because of the proclivities and the abilities and the sensitivities that human beings have. And the business of the human being is not work. The business of the human being is living as humanly as is possible. And living humanly means developing all the capacities that human beings have and that are peculiarly those of the human being, and which alone differentiates him from other kinds of animals. And so long as he doesn't develop those proclivities, so long as he doesn't develop those sensibilities and creative opportunities and powers that he has, to that degree, it seems to me, he is less human. So that we no longer have the problem of pure survival in terms of our modes of production and our abilities to produce and satisfy our survival and subsistence needs. And the degree to which we continue to place great emphasis on the mere matter of survival and consumption of goods, to that degree, it seems to me, we are betraying our own humanness, our own humanity. And this is a curious thing, that at a period when we are most affluent, we have the greatest degree of malaise, the greatest degree of purposelessness. Perhaps it has been because of this bad nurturing, this having been accustomed to putting our be-all and our end-all in the matter of work, when work no longer assumes the great importance it has assumed in the past. And because we haven't developed these other proclivities, we have this tremendous malaise, this discontent, this not knowing, the questioning where we're at and where we're going. I must say that this isn't a product in my own mind of affluence alone. It seems to me that underneath all, in view of the fact that most of us in this room have lived through two dreadful wars, the fact of the atomic bomb is one which, even though many of us may not discuss, and may not discuss for days on end, yet I'm convinced, and I sense it among young people too, who may not be discussing it publicly, a constant awareness and a wondering of, well, why is all of this worthwhile if tomorrow we may all go? There's no question in my own mind that this kind of implicit threat that underlies much of our conscious feeling and thinking is also a contributory factor. But there isn't any question, on the other hand, too, that this absence of pressures to work the 18-hour day, which was true even in our own country as short a time ago as 1919, when in the steel mills of the United States, the 16-hour, 7-day-a-week work week was still prevalent. So that it's hard to realize how far we've come in a comparatively short period of time. All of the great part of our leisure time for the masses, the degree of affluence and standard of living that has been achieved in this country is really a product of our own lifetimes. Within our own lifetime, much of this has been achieved. And this is something perhaps we haven't learned to live with adequately and to master. Erich Fromm puts it rather vividly when he talks about the current humanist complaint, in that we are not anymore the center of the universe. We are not anymore the purpose of creation. At one time, because of our religious training and the religious emphasis, and before the enormous advances in scientific knowledge, man was the center of the universe and the center of all man's thoughts. Today, we are not anymore the purpose of creation. We are not anymore the masters of a manageable and recognizable world. We are a speck of dust. We are a nothing, somewhere in space, without any kind of concrete relatedness to anything. So that leisure is not just release from toil. It is not just non-work. Real leisure is a very positive aspect of our lives, to be used positively if it is to be meaningful. For many of us, the more free time a man has, the less free very often he feels. He has commitments in 100 directions. None really engage his full interest or satisfy his deepest desires. He feels distracted rather than at peace. And I'm sure many of us have had this feeling in periods when we've had time off that we've looked forward to, and then when the day comes that we are free, the pressures of a host of minutiae of things to which we cannot say no present themselves. So we are constantly under the threat of boredom or the lure of distraction, without the capacity or the intention or the decisiveness to make our leisure time truly a time spent in the creation and the performance of acts and interests that we ourselves have decided upon. I know you've had some discussions of the lonely crowd of Riesman and the point that he makes about ours being essentially an other-directed society, that most of us are other-directed rather than inner-directed. That is, we are not autonomous beings. And if you examine your everyday life, not only in terms of your work, but your leisure time, you begin to recognize how little autonomy we have in most of the things that we do. Most of our social engagements are the product of a whole range of pressures that we ourselves don't really select, because these are the things that we truly want to do. Our social relationships, our job-related pressures, the things that our wives want us to do, that our husbands want us to do, that the children insist on doing, the demands that our churches and our organizations make upon us, frequently usurp all of our powers of independent decision. The need to live up to the Joneses, the need to have the things that other people have, these are not matters really of personal choice. These are matters that are foisted upon us without our thinking about them. It's just taken for granted that you live in Westwood today rather than the Fairfax section, just as the Fairfax was the place to live at 10 years ago rather than Boyle Heights. And this happens in every community of the country. You've got a social mobility that becomes tremendously important. You've got to move as an indication of status. You've got to get the bigger house. You've got to get the car and eventually the swimming pool. That's going to indicate to yourself as well as to others that, yes, you too are successful. You are as successful as the next person is. Now, these are obviously false values, because we find that moving to Westwood, to Beverly Hills, getting the swimming pool, does not give us that kind of satisfaction that we had hoped we would get. Because as we go higher and higher in steps of material accumulation, we constantly find that there are higher steps to go to. Even when you get your $1 million, there's still $2 million to be earned and $3 million to be earned, so that it becomes an endless business. I've always been puzzled by people who keep on making more and more money when they've got all the money they can possibly spend. The truth of the matter is that they've become so accustomed and enslaved by the process and the things that people do in the earning of the money that the money itself really isn't that important to them. But this has become a way of life. This has become a way of justification of existence. And you pursue and continue to do the kinds of things that you have done because this is the life you know, and truth to tell, no other life after a while has any meaning. And this is the dreadful tragedy of our day. The fact that we substitute the phony things for the real things in our lives. And we find that this preoccupation, the accumulation of status, of prestige, of money, substitutes and becomes the vicarious thing for the real things, which are the enjoyment of people and the enjoyment of ideas. And it's in that very pursuit and the competitiveness of that pursuit that our human relationships and our moral relationships and ethics become corroded. Because inevitably there is a conflict between our basic moral ethique and the drives in the accumulation of goods and services and wealth. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not averse to people having the good material things in life. All of us enjoy a better house rather than a poorer house, a better suit of clothes rather than a poorer suit of clothes. I am suggesting that the entire concentration of all our values on those things, these in the final analysis become corrosive and corrupting and destroy the vestige of the human values, which essentially are in understanding other people and loving other people and having relations with them and having a sense of ideas and artistic and creative expression, which in the final analysis give us the day-to-day richness of life that lends color to life, and without which life is barren, without color, and indeed a wasteland. And this we see on all sides of us. On the other hand, the exciting and encouraging aspect of recent years, at least to me, has been the enormous sense of people, just like you and myself, who become aware of these problems and of this conflict in our values, that there must be better values and a better way of life. And this, again, we see on all sides of us. I want to give you some very brief statistics on what has happened in our own community just in the past 10 years. Now, it's very difficult to get accurate statistics, and some of these statistics are somewhat misleading, others are quite valid, but I'll comment briefly upon them. Now, these figures were gotten by comparing the Los Angeles Times reported cultural events over a 10-year period from the years 1950-51 to 1960-61. In addition to these, actual figures of library circulation and library branches, which are quite accurate, were gotten. But comparing the figures in that decade, we find in the Los Angeles area that art museums have doubled, exactly doubled, from 7 to 14 art museums in the community. The number of art galleries, and I make the distinction between the gallery and the museum, the gallery being normally a profitable private establishment for the sale of paintings. Art galleries, too, have doubled in that period. Volumes in the LA Public Library increased by 1/3 in that period, and the LA Public Libraries now have over 3 million volumes. You might be interested to know that our own library here at UCLA has increased to over 1.5 million, one of the leading university libraries in the country, an institution which, as you know, is not more than 35 or 40 years old. During the past 3 years, funds have been appropriated for 28 new branch libraries in the city of Los Angeles, and circulation increased from 7 million to over 12 million. That's in a 3-year period. The LA County Library System circulation, the county, excluding the city of Los Angeles and excluding all incorporated areas, tripled to more than 8 million. And this, as I've indicated, does not include incorporated areas like Beverly Hills or Burbank, Glendale. The number of opera performances in the area increased by 30%, the number of symphony concerts by 43%, the number of modern dance recitals by 113%, ballet performances by 27%. You'll be interested to know again that in the offerings of our own Committee on Fine Arts Productions in this decade increased from approximately 40,000 in attendance, not the number of events now, but attendance increased from 40,000 to about 283,000 last year. Now, these are phenomenal increases and demonstrate the tremendous upsurgence and burgeoning of interest and excitement in the arts. Now, perhaps we place too much emphasis on numbers and size. What about the quality of these things? There, again, it's somewhat difficult to assess. When one looks at the offerings in our Sunday LA Times calendar, there's quite a range of offerings by quite a range of groups, and I suspect that the range in quality is very great indeed. I know, particularly in terms of theater offerings, that the quality of many of them are quite pedestrian. On the other hand, some of them are quite good indeed. The interesting thing, however, is the enormous interest that has developed in this recent decade in all of the cultural arts. The growing density of our population, which some of us regret, I for one certainly do, the high-rise buildings along Wilshire Boulevard, the tremendous traffic, dismay many of us. On the other hand, one must remember that it is only in a city of dense population that you can have a real flowering of artistic enterprise, because it is only because of density of population that you can have a range and variety of offerings that can draw upon a concentrated population and can survive. One of the difficulties in the past, I'm sure, in Los Angeles, in its cultural development, has been undoubtedly the sparsity and the diffusion and dispersion of its population. The fact that it was spread over so enormous an area that once people got home, they weren't going to travel 15 and 20 miles as one had to in order to attend a concert. Now, just one word more about the nature of this kind of activity. Some people are rather supercilious about this great burgeoning interest. They say that it's shallow, that we're developing what are called culture vultures, people who run around from gallery to gallery, who want to talk about the latest book in order to appear knowledgeable. People go to painting classes. It has become chic. It has become the mode. It's become the style to be interested in cultural things. Now, what are the motivations of people who engage in these kinds of activities? I think they're various, but on the whole, I wouldn't be supercilious about these activities and about these interests. I think the fact that a new image is appearing as to what is the worthwhile thing to do and what is not the worthwhile thing to do, in and of itself, is rather significant and indicative. I think the fact that people will, even though they just want to be seen at a concert, the fact that they'd rather be seen at a concert than at the racetrack, in and of itself, is an indication of a change of values that one must not sneer at. I'm not suggesting that this satisfies us and that we let it go at that. I think that much of our interest in the arts is of a shallow nature. But I think with that incipient kind of interest, one can build. One cannot build sophistication in people as to art or music or theater if they don't set foot in a music hall or in an art gallery or in a theater. The fact that they sense that this is the respectable, the better, the more approved thing to do, that in itself is an indication of some progress, and perhaps a great deal of progress. I think the role of our institutions, the role of our cultural organizations, is to attempt to stimulate a more profound and deeper interest in the arts. Because the importance of the arts is not for display, either for conversational display or to be seen in the proper public places. It seems to me that the excitement of the arts, in the last analysis, is a highly personal one. And upon exposure, even though one may come for the wrong reasons, like the child who starts eating spinach for the wrong reason being the fact that he's made to, develops a taste. And the same thing happens with this initial exposure to the arts. Tastes are developed. And tastes are developed that we ourselves frequently are not aware of, and despite ourselves. I know many of us who were overseas for long periods of time, either during the war or since the war, were amazed at the kinds of things that became terribly important to us and that we were completely unaware of. I know myself, was serving in the Pacific for about 3 years in quite isolated areas over long periods of time. I had never felt or thought of myself as a great music lover. I was an avid reader, and my wife would send me a case of books every month, and I spent a great deal of time reading and studying languages. But the thing that I missed most was hearing good music. And without having had any great training in music, the mere being away from it, suddenly one recognized an enormous void in one's life. And this was purely a matter of early exposure over a long period of time. The fact that one had been accustomed to hearing good music regularly, when it's taken away, it's like having a vitamin suddenly taken out of your diet, a crucial vitamin like vitamin C for a long period of time that you had taken for granted. And it is only when you don't have it that the results begin to appear. So that as we develop greater and greater exposure, it seems to me that we can also encourage and stimulate greater sophistication. Frankly, if 10 years from now we can see a sheer statistical, mathematical increase in our offerings commensurate with the past 10 years, where the quality of what is happening in this community not be any different or better 10 years from now than it is today, then I would be very unhappy indeed. and I would feel that perhaps we had made no progress. But I'm certain that there will be progress, as there has been, not only numerically and quantitatively in the last 10 years, but qualitatively as well. It seems to me we're on the threshold of a new epoch in our community and perhaps in the United States, that having achieved affluence in material things, we can now begin to turn our attention to the more important things, the matter of living rich and creative lives.
Mr. Kaplan tells me that this was 50 minutes on the nose. You know, we're all like that at UCLA. Time for 50 minutes. That presumably is why you're clapping. But well, I always delight in hearing Abbot Kaplan talk about the future, because one knows that when he predicts that something is going to happen culturally in Southern California, it's going to happen. He makes it happen, you see. And if you think that, there's some confusion, I regret to say this, there is some confusion in my mind as a result of his comments as to just what his intentions would be. I got the implication from his closing comments that the way to cure the cultural malaise of our people is to take away culture from them. And if the withdrawing of vitamin C, C of course stands for culture, Kaplan, so does K, you see. But if that's the solution, you can't count on any help from him, obviously. He's going to continue to dish up culture to us in a most enticing form. Well, he has invited you to disagree with him. You needn't disagree. You can also pose friendly questions. I turn him over to you and you over to him once again for whatever questions you may have.
Yes, sir.
What was the name of that book that you mentioned?
Hannah Arendt, The Human Condition. Yes.
You indicated a lot of percentage increases in the area. Did you indicate the population growth during the same period?
No, I did not, but almost in each category mentioned, the increase was greater than the population growth itself. But you must remember that what was indicated in terms of performances were not attendance, but the number of events, you see. Now, what the attendance at these activities were, other than our own Committee on Fine Arts Productions, where we do have actual figures on attendance, and if you'll recall, the figures there in the 10-year period were from 40,000 to 283,000, which is quite disproportionate to the population increase in that period.
But some of the numbers were probably less than that, like it was a 23%.
Yes, that would be true. I think that was in dance, as I recall. And as a matter of fact, dance has been less developed in this community than any of the other arts in recent years, particularly ballet, more so than modern dance, yes? And I'll get to you next. Well, I wouldn't want to prescribe whether bridge or reading is a better activity to engage in. I think that there are social opportunities for social interchange, I suppose, that bridge offers. I don't play bridge. If you talked about poker, I could speak more knowledgeably, but I'm assuming the same thing happens. I'm suggesting, however, as one who has played poker for 3 years, 365 nights a year, that's about 1,200 nights, starting at 7 in the evening till dawn. That's a lot of poker. And I'd like to suggest that while it was profitable financially, that in most other ways it didn't really warrant that investment of time. I think I learned to know these fellows pretty well, but I learned that the first 3 nights, and the other 900 nights was just redundant. I'd like to make another comment, and I make this quite seriously. In many of these areas, I hope you don't take what I say too authoritatively. These are essentially personal opinions. These are areas that we really don't know too much about. For example, one of our public relations people in Extension a couple of years ago made a great point and was tremendously delighted to publicize a woman who had been taking Extension courses with us for about, not 90 years, but about 23 years. Year after year was taking courses with us. And I began to wonder and worry about that. I'm not so sure that that's a cause for great jubilation. What I'm trying to say is that the matter of personal development, intellectual growth, and maturity is a highly personal affair, that one grows through personal study and development, and that people who become so dependent upon a class, upon a teacher, year in, year out, I'm afraid there's something wrong there, unless they're coming for purely social reasons and have no other kind of social life. And I would say, well, that's fine, if this is the best place to find a social milieu. But it would seem to me that unless education stimulates personal contemplation and thought and meditation and study and greater reading, unless it stimulates people not only to come to discussions of art and galleries publicly, but to personally engage in the artistic appreciation and enterprise, and by themselves, I'm not so sure that we have achieved what our entire goal ought to be. You were going to ask something, or make a comment.
It's rather similar to the last question. Well, I'll ask it all the same. Only instead of brick and poker, I was thinking of window breaking. It's the whole question of the cultural grasshopper, the cultural worm. I mean, there is this fascination now for the arts, which is drawing the youth away from healthy games like swimming or window breaking. Now, don't you think there is the danger of the development of the cultured worm, cultured, grass?
Well, I'm not suggesting that all people's free or leisure time ought to be engaged in, quote, the arts. I see nothing wrong in recreational sports. I would draw the line at window breaking. I don't understand the fascination that window breaking has for you. It isn't a particularly healthful exercise. I'm suggesting that part of our leisure time interest ought to be engaged in activities that develop our aesthetic sense and our intellectual ideas, that give us a sense of excitement about life, about the world, a sense of understanding, not only intellectually, but emotionally as well. And that is the kind of understanding we get more from painting, from poetry, from literature, not only in terms of ideas, but in terms of feeling, in terms of sensibility. And this we get from the great artist, from the great creator. And of course there are dangers of the culture worm, this notion that somehow by investing in this kind of activity, one begins to assume the guise and become part of the new elite. And there are these dangers. Some of us are disturbed at the notion of people taking a couple of art courses and having some facility at painting better than some others in the class, and within 6 months' time, you see them exhibiting publicly. Now, I think there are dangers. I think we've got to make a differentiation between the amateur and the amateur's interest in the arts and the professional artist. And there's a great distinction between them, and the goals are not at all the same. Now, a very talented person who starts as an amateur can become a professional, but that's a long haul, and immediately the goals and the preoccupation and the discipline becomes an entirely different kind of thing. It is not the same thing anymore at all. And I would make a very fundamental distinction between the professional artist and the amateur. And unfortunately, the amateur doesn't always make that distinction. But sooner or later, the world makes it for him, and he learns. Yes?
You've raised something that seems rather puzzling, and that is the world eventually makes it for him, but often, as you imply, the world is not given the opportunity to make that selection for him. And because he is not a professional, he is perhaps scorned, or because he is not a professional, he is accused of social problems or emotional problems or other things of this nature. So that the line you draw between the professional and the long years which bring him to that point and the amateur, who may be scoffed about by the professionals and those who decide which amateurs become the professionals, becomes quite a difficult situation.
Well, I would suggest that the criterion becomes one of judgment. The amateur is an amateur not because he hasn't been at it as long as the professional, but because the quality of his work is not professional, is amateurish. Now, in the painting field particularly, and today with our preoccupation and the new academy that we've established of abstract expressionism, it becomes much easier for the amateur, I suppose, to perhaps disguise his efforts and appear to be more like the professional. But by and large, I don't think that's true. The first-rate abstract expressionist is normally a person who has had tremendous years of disciplined training, and the visitation of exhibits of amateurs, while the sounds are the same in a sense, that is, the motions are the same rather, the music is really different that comes out in those paintings. And I'm not objecting to an amateur wanting to become a professional, but the moment he wants to become a professional, it seems to me the approach, the discipline, the dedication becomes an entirely different kind of thing, and the objective becomes a different thing. Yes?
At what time in life should a busy person start thinking of occupancy of leisure so as to enjoy himself?
Well, the point that I've been trying to make, sir, is the fact that this has got to be part of our daily living from the time we're 5 or 6 years old in terms of the kinds of interests that we develop. One doesn't suddenly develop an interest in reading or in music or in art at age 65 when he retires. I think the kind of training and exposure we have, the kind of interest that we cultivate and develop all our lives, those are the things that are going to be our solace and are going to be meaningful to us and enrich our lives throughout our lives. Now, I'm not saying that if you haven't done it by the time you were 6 years old and from then onward, that there isn't any hope. I'm suggesting that this is something one develops all along the line, and that we're capable of developing these things. I'm going to just mention one brief story that some of you may have heard, and you're probably tired of it, but it was so meaningful to me that I can never cease from repeating it. And this was a situation during the war where on the flagship of the PT boats of the Pacific, we had all kinds of youngsters, primarily from the South for some reason, because PT boats were supposed to be very glamorous, and that was before a recent election. And for some reason, as I've indicated, we had youngsters from rural areas of the South who hadn't had very much education. Most of them hadn't been more than 10 miles away from where they had been born up until the time they went into the Navy. And we used to stand the midnight watch, which started at about midnight and went till 4 in the morning, night after night. I was the senior officer of the deck and got to know, and I had been on the boats with these kids before we went to the flagship, so I knew many of them quite well. And after the first discussions, you know, you'd have 4 hours standing there, and there'd be a youngster at the log and one at the wheel and a messenger and a couple of gunner's mates, about 8 or 9 youngsters there every night. And they'd tell all the dirty stories they knew, and they'd talk about women and other mundane things. And after they had exhausted these topics, they began to talk about things that were really on their minds. And here were youngsters, many of them with less than an 8th or a 9th grade education, talking about very fundamental theological problems, like, what are we doing out here? Where are we going? All our lives we've lived in this little area, and now we're right in the middle of the ocean going out to kill people we never saw. Or they'd ask fundamental theological questions as to, gee, we pray to a God and they pray to a God, and our God blesses us, our ministers bless us, and their ministers bless them, and then we go out and kill each other with the blessings of the same God. Now that doesn't make any sense, they would say. Or they would say, if God is omniscient and omnipotent, and they didn't use these words, how does he permit this kind of business to take place? And we'd get into discussions, theological discussions in comparative religion. And of course, what soon became apparent was that they knew nothing about their own religious doctrine. One kid was a Presbyterian, the another was a Baptist. He didn't know the difference between being a Presbyterian or a Baptist or a Catholic. We'd get into these discussions, into political discussions as to why the war. And these youngsters, because this was sort of a bull session, it wasn't a classroom, it wasn't a disciplined sort of thing, they became tremendously interested. And within a year's time, we had a university going on in that ship. They'd say, well, how do you know about Presbyterianism? You're not a Presbyterian. How do you know about all these people, about Calvin and Knox and that sort of thing? And I'd say, well, I just once read a book. And they'd want to get hold of that book. And gradually, paperbacks were to be found all over that ship. And these youngsters, whom one would normally say had no intellectual interest, who all this time had been reading comic books and Western books, became terribly excited because we were talking about problems that were inherent in the situation in which they found themselves, which puzzled them, and which normally they never had any chance to talk about. And here they had a chance to talk and begin to see some glimmer of meaning. And this became an exciting thing for them. I'm trying to suggest that intellectualism, the arts, are not the prerogatives or the food for an elite, for a small group of people. I'm suggesting that the average person of average intelligence can become tremendously excited about ideas, can be tremendously excited about the arts, if they're brought to him naturally and made meaningful. I don't know what it is that happens in our school system, what it is that corrupts little children, who are so free, who are so spontaneous, who are so curious about everything. Any of you have had a little 3-year-old girl? I've got a little niece around the corner these days. And there's no end to the questions that she asks, no end to her intellectual curiosity, no end to her spontaneity, no end to her lovingness, her wanting to embrace the whole world. And we look at that child, that lovely, wonderful, uncorrupted creature, and we say to ourselves, what is it that happens to children when they become adolescents and adults? That